Welcome to our event on smart cities and democratic vulnerabilities. I'm Damon Wilson, President and CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy. Today, we'll be hearing from remarkable experts about a challenge at the intersection of technology and democracy. Smart city projects are one of the many digital innovations that are transforming how governments and societies operate. Our participants are going to share what they've learned about the risks and opportunities that come with this transformation and the steps that we can take to make sure that digitalization works for democracy. Their work is featured in a new must-read report from our own International Forum for Democratic Studies. Today, the pace of digital change means that there is a new, constantly evolving backdrop for the global struggle between democracy and autocracy. Cutting-edge tools like AI-powered systems for generating text or recognizing faces are becoming more widely available. More devices than ever are connecting to 5G networks and transmitting an unprecedented volume of information. Yet against the expectations that many had a decade ago, the revolution in digital connectivity has not simply translated into gains for freedom. Instead, new digital authoritarian tools and models are challenging democracy. While the democracy community has focused much of its attention on threats linked to online content, this is just one part of the broader challenge. Autocrats are using political and technological strategies to deepen state surveillance, to tighten control over the internet, and to shift global norms in ways that legitimize digital repression. The People's Republic of China, in particular, is pushing the boundaries of digital totalitarianism at home while exporting advanced digital tools and infrastructure to every continent, including so-called safe city projects. How societies navigate these challenges, how they protect privacy as new technologies collect ever greater amounts of data, how they guard against malign authoritarian influence through digital exports, and how they ensure that citizens have a voice and decisions about digitalization will be a critical part of the struggle to uphold democratic norms. Smart city projects introduce new digital systems to govern cities, and they're increasingly popular in both autocratic and democratic settings. They hold out the promise of making governance more efficient and responsive by collecting and analyzing data about urban life. But when governments fail to establish democratic oversight of smart cities, these projects and the information they gather can instead end up serving authoritarian actors and undermining democratic principles like accountability, equality, and respect for human rights. So our guests, Roukaya, Kasenally, and Bárbara Simão, have researched the challenges around crafting democratic norms for smart cities in Brazil and Mauritius. They'll be joined by eminent democracy scholar and longtime friend of the Endowment, Larry Diamond, who will give some context on what digital governance challenges like the ones we're seeing around smart cities mean for the future of democracy and how democracies can build their resilience to risks associated with the technology. So as we strive for a more democratic digital future, the work of scholars, journalists, and activists, including NED's partners, will be crucial in shedding light on how governments are using technology. And we hope that today's conversation will accelerate our learning together on how democracies can raise their game when it comes to governing new digital tools and deepen our awareness of how digital risks are interacting with the global challenge of democratic backsliding. And ultimately, how we harness technology to bolster, not undermine, democracy. So with that, let me turn it over to our own Beth Curley, who's been leading this extraordinary work at the Endowment and who will moderate our discussion today. Beth, over to you.
Thanks so much, Damon, for that introduction, and welcome to all of our viewers online in whatever time zones you may be. So we have, as Damon mentioned, a great lineup of speakers here today to share their reflections on what smart cities mean for democracy and the risks that can emerge when these initiatives intersect with the erosion of democratic guardrails. As Damon mentioned, the Forum recently released a report on smart cities and democratic vulnerabilities, where we looked at privacy issues and authoritarian influence, among other risks in smart cities, projects that leverage data collection and analysis using AI and the Internet of Things to streamline municipal governance. We also discussed the broader tension that can sometimes emerge between public participation on the one hand and technocratic visions that treat new digital tools as opportunities for control on the other. With smart cities gaining popularity around the world, these are global challenges, and it's key to understand how they intersect with local political dynamics. We'll be discussing these issues with a particular focus on our case studies from Brazil and Mauritius, and we'll also be reflecting on strategies to establish democratic norms and standards to address these risks and leverage tech for democracy. A quick housekeeping note before I begin. The first hour of this event will be a moderated conversation among our speakers, but during that time, we encourage you to enter your questions using the YouTube live chat function on our live stream. And at 1 o'clock Eastern time, we'll turn to pose a selection of these questions to our panelists. And now I'll give a quick introduction of our expert speakers. We have here with us Roukaya Kasenally, Associate Professor at the University of Mauritius and a former Reagan-Fussell Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy. Bárbara Simão, Head of Research for Privacy and Surveillance at Internet Lab in Brazil. And Larry Diamond, who is William L. Clayton Senior Fellow at Stanford University, Mosbacher Senior Fellow in Global Democracy at the Freeman Spokane Institute for International Studies, and founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy. Roukaya and Bárbara will be sharing some findings from their essays in our report, and Larry will be drawing on his expertise as a democracy scholar to offer some context on the significance of these trends. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to Roukaya to kick us off. So Roukaya, your essay for our report focused heavily on the risks around the Mauritius Safe City project. Very briefly, what is that project, and why are you, as someone who has been a student and a scholar of democracy, interested and concerned about that project and how it's going?
Thank you very much, Beth, and thank you for having me in this webinar. I think, just to provide a little bit of, the history and the evolution of the Safe City, it was announced in 2016 during a budget speech, and then it was inaugurated in December 2019. And what we saw in December 2019 was 4,000 cameras that were laid out of which 2,760 are currently operational. We saw 3,000 what we call box cameras and 1,000 dome cameras. These cameras have facial and license plate recognition capacity. There's a main command and control center. It's recording 24/7, and there's a storage lifeline of what they call 30 days. But there is a big question mark. After 30 days, where does it go? Now, the Mauritius Safe City project, CP, is part of Huawei's Safe City sort of scenario that is actually being rolled out in a number of African countries. Now, as a democracy scholar and someone that has been looking and assessing the quality of democracy in my own country, but also across Africa, it was part of an unsolicited bid from Huawei. We were aware that there was a need for what we call a simple upgrade of CCTV cameras for the police, but not a full-fledged safe city, which is costing, as I mentioned, $450 million to the public purse. The second thing was, I'm concerned about the utility of such a project. How efficient it is, what is it going to be done for, can we afford it, is it really helping in terms of assuring the quality of citizens' life? Was my question around intentionality. The narrative in terms of marketing and justifying that is around safety and security. But as I started to sort of unpack the Safe City project, I realized that it very often or totally bordered on what we call surveillance and control. My concern was also linked to the fact that the Safe City coming into scene also coincided with what we call Mauritius backsliding in terms of democratic backsliding. There has been a sharp decline in satisfaction around democracy on the island. The island has also been recently in 2020 and 21 being classified as among the top 10 autocratizing countries in the world. And that thickness and opacity around the project made it really a matter of concern. Last but not least, the total absence of public debate about whether we should have such a project, what would such a project bring in terms of quality, in terms of dynamics. So these were some of my key concern, and these all are deepening as the Mauritius Safe City is going on.
Thanks very much, Roukaya. So I think you gave us a great overview of some of the issues we'll be discussing further about both challenges involved with the management of smart cities, such as where is the data going, and challenges involved with decision-making around smart cities and whether they are in fact transparent and participatory. And also, I think an important point came out there about safe cities in particular. So of the many types of smart city initiatives, these are particularly focused on public security and raise particular concerns about surveillance in accordance. Turning now to Bárbara, in Brazil, the debate around smart cities looks a little bit different. There are many vendors involved in the sales landscape. We're not just talking about a single project as in the Mauritius case. And for another thing, a very interesting feature of the Brazilian smart cities landscape is that your democratic institutions, in dialogue with civil society, have made some really intriguing efforts to apply democratic principles to these projects, perhaps in theory addressing some of the concerns Roukaya mentioned. So could you tell us a little bit about these efforts to establish democratic norms for smart cities? And again, in just a few quick words, which we'll unpack more later, are they working?
Thank you, Beth, for the introduction and for the invitation to be here and participate at this amazing event, and also for the invitation to write this piece on the Brazil case on smart cities and their impacts on democracy and democratic values. And to answer your question and give this brief introduction on the Brazilian case, yes, it's really interesting that we have had this participatory process, this participatory experience in the construction of the Brazilian Charter for Smart Cities. This process was led by the Brazil's Ministry of Regional Development, and the Charter aspires to be a democratic political document that expresses a public agenda for the digital transformation of cities. And it outlines some recommendations and in support of strategic goals that touch on themes from sustainable development and urban inequality to data privacy. So this process happened between 2019 and 2020 and involved 3 rounds of consultations and input from more than 200 civil society stakeholders. And it really shows awareness of the need to consult different stakeholders, prioritize human rights, and engage the wider public in what the Charter calls democratic management of cities. But most important, the Charter also establishes a number of key democratic principles, such as the crucial role of civil society organizations, as well as the educational and research institutions in disseminating knowledge and ensuring the quality of the public debate. It also emphasizes that authorities should hire project implementers that are committed to human rights. It calls for smart cities to meet standards of cybersecurity, transparency, and privacy protection with regard to their handling of data, and reinforces that these projects should serve the public interest above all. So there was this effort to articulate a participatory vision for smart cities here in Brazil. But on the ground, however, what we found is that officials and vendors are still far from taking the steps needed to ensure that municipal digitalization serves democracy. In a research, the Internet Lab conducted together with Article 19 and LAPIN, a research lab here in Brazil, we identified some gaps in the management of the Brazilian smart cities that threaten to seriously undermine democratic principles. And these issues include a lack of transparency, privacy risks, discrimination against historically marginalized groups, increased surveillance, and unbalanced relationships between local governments and private companies responsible for the development of these technologies. But this is just a brief introduction, and I'm looking forward to speak more with the questions you have heard. So thank you.
Thanks, Bárbara. And we'll definitely be unpacking some of those specific obstacles that get in the way of realizing a participatory vision around smart cities later on in our conversation. But before we do, I just wanted to turn quickly to Larry to help us set the stage for this discussion. So in your scholarship and in your research collaborations, you've engaged in many different ways with the implications of technological change for democracy and with the threat of digital authoritarianism. And to better situate our discussion in the global political landscape and in the struggle between democracy and autocracy, might you offer a few words on why the kind of technology governance questions that our authors here have been looking at are a critical issue, not just for technical specialists, but also for democracies? Over the coming years, how do you see projects like smart cities impacting the democratic trajectories of the countries that adopt them?
Well, profoundly. And thank you for having me, Beth. And thank you. I mean, this is just another example, other issues of technology, kleptocracy, sharp power, of the National Endowment for Democracy and its international forum, I think, being on the cutting edge of vital issues affecting the future of democracy. So with respect to this one, well, our world is becoming digitized, and data is, as they say, the new oil, which is why we should be alarmed at China's thirst for it on every front. And on almost every front of life today, so much of which is lived online or, in the data sphere, whether from people's mobile phones or their desktop computers or whatever it might be, or their unwitting surrender of data because of these various forms of electronic surveillance. All sorts of organizations, but not least governments, and cities are only one level of government, are amassing data on people, and people have a very dim awareness of what it means for their privacy, what it means for their human rights, what it means for their control over their lives, not only now or next year, but potentially into perpetuity, depending on how this data is managed and retained or not, and whether, what the Europeans call, and it's seeping into some law in the US, the right to be forgotten is enforced or not. So, I'll just echo a couple points you made in your opening remarks or implied, Beth. There's a fine line between the legitimate need for these tools for public security. Think of all the criminal cases recently, horrific crimes we've broken with the aid of photo surveillance. So, let's keep in mind there is a legitimate role for photographic surveillance in protecting people on the other side from crime and terrorism and so on, and enforcing the law. But who's doing it? Who's capturing the data? Who's retaining the data? Who the heck are these private vendors? When you're talking about issues like this and you connect these levels of profundity and sensitivity in terms of people's rights to the word vendor, I mean, that alone makes me nervous. And so I come back to what Bárbara said, what I think is an underlying theme that runs through this, and that is democratic oversight. And I'm sure as this session goes along, we'll dig deeper into how Brazil has thought about structuring this, how it could be structured, what kinds of specialties and lines of experience and citizen voice should be drawn into participatory oversight of this. I think these are all really important questions. And then, as you know, Beth, at some point, I'd like to talk about the Chinese angle, and maybe in the wake of the Chinese balloon, it's not a bad time to talk about the Chinese angle, because I think it's got some very chilling and important distinctive dimensions to it.
Great, thanks, Larry. And we will be coming back to you for a further series of thoughts, including on PRC surveillance writ large, if perhaps not balloons per se, at the end of this conversation. So I would like to turn now to go through some of the key themes in our report that have emerged in these specific cases around smart cities, to a back and forth for the next half hour or so between Roukaya and Bárbara. And in order to keep this moving and survey the many issues at play here, I'd ask that you just keep your answers to these questions to about 2 or 3 minutes, although each of them, again, we could say much more. And I'd like to start with a question that is actually very closely related to the challenges that Larry has just raised, and to look at how you've seen this playing out in the cases that you've studied, and this is the issue of data governance. Smart city projects involve the constant collection of digital data that could take many forms. It could be monitoring who's walking on streets. It could be data about educational activities. It could be sharing government databases with private vendors. So as you, Bárbara, and your co-author, Blenda Santos, noted in your essay, some of this information can touch on very sensitive categories such as gender, class, or ethnicity. It can include people's addresses. It has many potential applications. So starting with you and then turning to Roukaya, what risks does the collection of digital data in smart city projects pose to democracy? And what, if anything, do you see being done to mitigate those risks?
Thanks for the question, Beth. And to answer it, I think I should mention that in our research, we found that the greatest share of ICT, the technology projects, seem to be concentrated into 4 main categories: connectivity projects, urban mobility projects, education, and public safety. Connectivity projects are aimed at boosting citizens' access to digital networks or services through infrastructure advancements, offering free Wi-Fi in public spaces, facilitating access to government bureaucracies or public services, among other innovations. In urban mobility, the main ICTs involve databases, electronic ticketing, and smart traffic lights. Educational ICTs include the management and teaching software, and also the use of facial recognition cameras for the management of schools. And projects involving public safety might also involve the use of video surveillance cameras and biometric technology to verify citizens. Facial recognition technologies that automatically identify across those categories. So there's a really, the use of this technology here in Brazil is increasing. So that's something that we noted in our research. And while some of the ICTs may offer benefits in terms of efficiency, convenience, and connectivity, those specific applications, as well as the broad trend toward personal data collection, can also threaten democratic values. Digitalizing public services, for example, can deepen social inequalities in Brazil, since we have a great digital divide, unequal access to digital networks across different social groups, and can place these services out of reach for marginalized communities. Also, digital educational technologies may jeopardize privacy and equal opportunity for children and adolescents, which are particularly vulnerable groups, since they doesn't have their reasoning fully developed yet. And also the public safety field, the use of facial recognition technology has increased the number of people wrongly identified as having committed crimes. But beyond these case-specific concerns, most smart cities, ICTs, carry risks related to the use and handling of personal data. As you mentioned, these projects frequently involve either collecting new personal data from citizens or providing data that is already in the authorities' possession to outside contractors and private companies. Sensitive information about individuals' gender and sexuality, race and ethnicity, class, age are often included in a political context where powerful actors dispute the very concept of human rights, and acts of violence are systemic, especially against historically marginalized groups such as women or LGBTQ+ population. And this practice could endanger citizen safety as well as their rights to privacy and equal treatment. Moreover, the collective risk of these data-driven projects is greater than the sum of its parts, since personal data taken from different contexts can also be combined in ways that present new threats to privacy and human rights. And by that, I mentioned the vast number of inferences that can be made by conjunction of data. So I think these are the main risks that we found of concern here in Brazil, and I'll leave it here. And
yeah, thanks. So that just gives us a sense of the sheer scope of types of projects and dimensions of urban life that are being captured in the form of digital data by smart city projects. And to kind of pull out what I think are a few key themes there. One is the intersection of data collection and inequality. And there's been many studies, for instance, on how facial recognition technologies can have discriminatory impacts. And I think there are many more questions to be answered around how the use of automatic prediction tools based on this digital data collection can reinforce inequalities in other segments of society. And then turning to Roukaya, I know the facial recognition issue will be probably a theme in your response as well. So challenges linked to data governance, data handling, et cetera, in the Mauritius Safe City project.
Well, I think, Bárbara gave it a background to, some of the trappings of data collection problems. And I think the biggest problem in Mauritius is it's an open canvas. Nothing has been done to actually securitize the data collection process. I think the greatest threat is about, what can be done and what can this data be used. Monitoring, pinpointing, controlling citizens, crushing dissent, it's very, very new. So anything can be made possible. Now, for me, the issue around ethics is extremely important, the manner in which no understanding or no people have given their consent, so I think this is something which is extremely problematic, and people are not even aware of what their data is being, recorded on 24/7. The other issue around, and I mentioned that the lack of public debate, which is crucial in terms of this lack of knowledge and this lack of, awareness and willingness to sort of deal with this particular issue. We've seen over time, and this is linked to the digital democratic backsliding of Mauritius, that there has been a slow but constant settling of what we call self-censorship on the island. People are a little bit more concerned about what they speak, what they say, because there is this sort of understanding that there's Big Brother out there, whether it's the safe city cameras, or whether there is a surveillance of social media, which happened, there was a proposal in 2001, or the picking up of journalists or harassment of journalists or closing down of radio stations. So we're in an ecosystem where, the data control and monitoring is a real issue. People are aware of that. And the issue around data and digital data is that the footage or the data that's coming out of the Mauritius Safe City is actually under the jurisdiction of the Mauritius police. Now, this is a big problem because the Mauritius police is currently at the lowest level of public trust. People do not trust the Mauritian police. More importantly, that recently in the last year or so, the Mauritian police has been weaponized to actually sort of do the dirty business of the government, to pick up people who are potentially, dissentful, or who are creating a stir in the public sphere, or who are, speaking their mind in the social media space. Now, you ask the question of what can be done to mitigate these risks. Unfortunately, the current Mauritius Safe City project doesn't have any regulatory or legal framework that accompanies it. There is a Data Protection Act of 2017. There's a Data Commission officer who sits and who has an office. There's even a code of practice for the Mauritius Safe City project. But there is a clear caveat there that personal data will not be protected if there is a clause named linked to public security, defense, or any form of security. And this particular clause, supersedes everything else. And basically, personal data is at risk, and the person who can use that to actually the clause is the Prime Minister. So it's one person that has the ability to sort of roll back or create a very, very unprotected, very vulnerable environment for data. So I think we are in a very fraught situation in terms of what that data can be used, and linked it up to the democratic sort of backsliding of the island and the slow rise of authoritarianism. I think it is a very explosive situation that can go all the way in terms of, breaking down those very cherished political liberties and civil rights that Mauritians have always cherished.
All right, thank you both. So again, I think the intersection of online and offline surveillance was a very interesting theme that came through in your essay. And I think that provides an important piece of context here. And I know Bárbara mentioned this as well, that when you have different data streams that are coming together, there's a risk in terms of the conclusions, correct or incorrect, that the authorities or whoever else is using these technologies can draw, that perhaps goes beyond what happens when we're looking at any individual data stream. I think the question of the difference between having data protection legislation formally in place and actually ensuring that it's providing a safeguard against government abuses in every particular situation, especially when there are these kinds of carve-outs, is another really important question. That perhaps I hope we can come back to later, but I know I have promised to keep us moving. So turning to a related question, right? We asked earlier, do we really know what's being done with the data that's collected? And in order to answer that question, it's important to have transparency. But a lack of transparency is an issue that both of you have cited, as well as many of our other collaborators on emerging technologies when they look at these big public sector digitalization projects. Why do you think there is such a persistent pattern of opacity in these kinds of projects? And what are the obstacles that stand in the way to realizing democratic norms around transparency in this sphere?
So Beth, as you mentioned previously, there are a lot of technology companies that specialize in offering smart cities technologies for municipalities. But when we are trying to discover which are these companies and which are the grounds of the contracts they have with the public sector and the public managers, it's difficult to discover because the contracts are often left unavailable to the public access, and they often lack specific provisions on the use of data, even when the projects involve extensive access to personal information. And well, without those information, those safeguards, data ownership may be unclear, and disputes may arise around what happens with personal data after they are used by this private company and in the terms of this private-public partnership. So opacity is a really important issue we found here in Brazil. Many of the FOIA, the Freedom of Information requests, we send to the local governments regarding the use of technologies by the cities were left unanswered, or those which were answered weren't like complete responses. They lack specific information, specific provisions on the contract, specific content that we demanded to understand more of how these technologies were being developed in the context of the cities here in Brazil. So they suffer from opacity, and this opacity, it also elevates questions such as, well, what kinds of projects are being implemented and why, and for whom, with what with what justification they're being implemented, what they will cost, and who sells and operates the resulting systems from this technology. And I think to answer what could increase this problem here in Brazil, we don't have direct answers to that, but I think there is maybe a lack of human resources prepared to deal with specific demands regarding technology, specifically between the public managers that are responsible for it, and also a lack of federal incentives to transparency. At the federal level, at least, this was an issue. The former government Bolsonaro, which didn't value transparency as a democratic value, and often refused to answer some of the FOIA requests sent it to the federal government arguing secrecy and data protection infringements. So there was also this question regarding the federal level of the government here in Brazil, at least at the former years. And this relation between the transparency and data protection also means that there is a problem of awareness on the fact that data protection actually doesn't contradict transparency at all, although both subjects might overlap at some point, but they are not contradiction between themselves. And that's a confusion that is happening here in Brazil. And I think scholars have like the need to create awareness on what actually is the relation between these two really important laws for our democracy here. So I would mention these problems and maybe these reasons for why transparency is being an issue here at the development of smart cities projects.
Thanks very much. And I think that, like Roukaya's previous statement, kind of highlights the intersection between political trends at the national level and broader challenges to democratic guardrails, in this case, how well freedom of information mechanisms are working, whether political authorities place a high priority on transparency, and the ability to even have the meaningful discussions and meaningful oversight that you would need in order to govern smart cities. That second issue that you mentioned, again, I wish we had more time because I really would love to have a discussion on that. It certainly is, I think, something that's been in the news in a variety of settings lately, and just kind of to put that on the table a bit for our audience. So there's, in some cases, there's presented as being a tension between regulations that require the protection of personal data on the one hand, and the demands of civil society groups, journalists, and so forth for data from the government on the other hand. I think there are certain cases where we actually have seen these kinds of conflicts in other sectors, for instance, when looking at beneficial ownership information about companies, but in many cases that we're talking about different types of data, right? On the one hand, we're looking at whether citizens can access information about their governments, and that's transparency. And then on the other hand, we're looking at how easy it is for governments and vendors and others to get and share information about citizens, and that's where the data protection angle comes in. Yeah, thanks for kind of introducing some of these higher level issues here. Roukaya, transparency also an issue you've already raised a bit in the Mauritius case, but just speaking broadly, where do you think these obstacles to transparency are coming from, and what strategies might be used to deal with them?
Well, basically, you know, the Mauritius Safe City thrives on opacity and lack of transparency, you know, because that's really what made it come so fast. Between 2016 and 2019, you have a super project, you know, fast-tracked, and I think it really oiled itself around opacity. You know, in the case of Mauritius and the whole issue around opacity and lack of transparency, I think it's important to conceptualize the role that Huawei has played in the digitalization or the rollout of digitalization on this small island state. Huawei rolled out 3G, 4G, 5G. It has been also very instrumental in developing a number of applications that are linked to public money transfer. It was also responsible for a submarine cable that links Mauritius to one of the small island states, and obviously for the Mauritius Safe City project. But I think one of the biggest problems around transparency in this project was around the flaunting of the Public Procurement Act. I mean, this is a fundamental act that actually ensures that big ticket projects go through the right procedure, and that, you know, that systems of checks and balances, that that there is a competitive bidding process happens. But this didn't at all happen, and we are seeing subsequently with any projects that have to do with China, and more recently now with India, are actually going along flaunting the public procurement procedure. In the case of the Mauritius Safe City, there were multiple confidentiality clauses, non-disclosure clauses that were smacked onto this whole project. So it completely eluded any form of public scrutiny. Unlike Brazil, we do not have a Freedom of Information Act or a Right to Information Act. We've been asking that for the last 15 years, but this has been completely thrown aside. So I think in the absence of, you know, this sort of check and balance, the quality of institutions, the rule of law that is applied, you know, the whole system is thrown aside. And I think, you know, also there has been public support for the vendor like Huawei. And we had our prime minister, our current prime minister, openly declared that, you know, he believes that Huawei is in terms of a trusted partner for Mauritius. And he also visited the Huawei headquarters during the 2018, I think, forum, or Africa forum, China forum in Beijing. So I think all that tells you about, you know, how, you know, the systematic avoidance of transparency, you know, and thriving on a culture of opacity has been really the foundation, if I can use, of the Mauritius Safe City. And as I said, it actually sort of was fast-tracked. A big project where you're installing 4,000 cameras in 3 years. This is, you know, this is very fast track. So I think these are the many issues that we found, the problems that we stumbled against, and the fact that, you know, anyone who wanted to break into that were completely hitting against a brick wall.
So again, a rather disturbing pattern here, and I think speaking particularly to the practices of Huawei around the Safe City project and the presence of these non-disclosure agreements. Again, very important issue. So we have just 5 minutes left before we turn to our comments from Larry. And to close us out, this theme has come up in a recurring way throughout your responses, but I wonder if either of you have some final words that you'd like to add on what you see as the relationship between the broader challenges associated with democratic backsliding in your countries and the ability of democratic institutions and civil society to get a handle on governing smart city projects. And Roukaya, when I come back to you, if you want to add a few more words about Huawei there, that would be fine. So Bárbara, starting with you on the democratic backsliding piece, if there's anything you'd like to add before we go to Larry.
I think I would like to mention that these surveillance technologies here in Brazil are increasing, and the reason for they to be increasing is mainly grounded on a public discourse that claims the fight against violence, which is a really pressing demand here in Brazil, because we have really significant rates of violence here in the country. but the public discourse of mayors and public managers in relation to that don't consider the fact that these technologies can also be harmful for citizens here in Brazil, can be harmful for democracy. And they maybe lack awareness on the specific issues these technologies have. So that's one of the reasons why we studied the implementation of ICTs here in Brazil, to see if we can raise awareness on that, especially for those public managers which are trying to use technology for a good purpose, but are not understanding the risks also associated with the use of these technologies. So I think this is one challenge we have here, to combat this type of argument that thinks that technology is a solution for everything, not considering the fact that maybe we have better solutions than technology for different purposes. And technology should be, I think, used when it has a purpose, it has a specific reason to be developed, and it can increase, it can also be used to increase democracy, it can also be used for a better purpose, but they should have this in mind, that there are also risks involved, and so that evaluations on the human rights impacts and data protection impacts should be done before the adoption or the application of these sorts of technology. But I think this is the debate that still has to develop here, at least in Brazil. I think I have these general thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks very much. And again, very recurring issue that we hear about in discussing these types of projects, the kind of lure of techno-solutionism, especially when you have vendors coming around and saying, look, this will solve all your problems, and the importance of addressing technology in perhaps a more intentional way to make sure that it serves the needs of the municipality as determined by the people and by democratic institutions. Roukaya, closing words from you.
Closing words for me, I think it's the way Huawei conducts its business. We recently saw a backlash around the Safe City project, because there was what they call a sniffing episode in Mauritius late last year, where there was this understanding that the Safe City was being used as a backdoor to actually snoop into data. And that created a really, really big milestone between some of the key diplomatic missions on the island. So Huawei was accused of actually digital espionage through its Safe City. So that shows you, some of the very, very sort of troubling sort of outcomes that can come out of that. But I also wanted to turn the light and the spotlight probably on our own national governments. I think, Huawei is what it is, Chinese vendors is what it is. We also emphasize earlier, I mentioned our vulnerability, but also our over-dependency on one service provider, digital service provider. But our governments are also to be, blamed, and we can't just put all the blame at the door of Huawei or China. So we have seen that there's been a possibility of kickbacks linked to the Mauritius Safe City project. We also have to be very careful about dangling super loans that are given to us for prestige projects, because the Mauritius Safe City has gone about being said that, oh yes, we have a Mauritius Safe City and we are part of the digitalization sort of countries. So I think we have to be extremely careful. And I wanted to rejoin and what Larry had said earlier, data, the new currency, and how it's being used, because as I mentioned, we are smack in the middle of the Indian Ocean, where data is crisscrossing with so many submarine cables. So I think we have to be very, very careful in terms of how we position ourselves, how we protect ourselves. And I think at the end of the day, when I think about political outcomes and the backlash around democratic backsliding, I'm very, very concerned by what I have seen in Uganda and Zambia. We have a general election coming up in 2024. Will the data from the Safe City be used to snoop on political opponents, on crush dissent? That is a big question mark for me.
So some sobering thoughts to leave us off on, but I think very important ones. And now turning back to Larry for, again, some contextualization and building on these thoughts, reflecting on those preceding comments from our authors, was there anything new that stood out to you in terms of the interplay between these digital projects and the erosion of democratic norms? And looking across these challenges, what new approaches or capacities do you think it's important for democracies, including actors in civil society, to develop in order to responsibly manage them and make sure that digital risks don't end up deepening democratic backsliding?
Yeah, just taking notes on what you've asked me here. Okay, well, you know, this has already been an incredibly rich and important discussion, Beth. I think one new thing, kind of a slap in the face, whether gentle or not, from Brazil is that this is galloping forward in a country that, you know, may have some elements of democratic backsliding, but, you know, is a serious and I would say still vibrant democracy in the Americas, and not backsliding nearly as much as a number of others, and probably not backsliding as much as what Roukaya has been describing. So I'm going to share in a minute a set of problems for liberal democracy, even much more liberal democracies than Brazil. But I think one of the messages here, which you can glean from Barbara's remarks and just from all of this, is this is not like just a problem for Latin America or Africa or you know, emerging market countries. This is a problem for everybody. And as I'll make clear in a minute, it's not just a problem for government surveillance and data capture. Let me then note the key points I wanted to make. Start by putting it in the broadest sociological context. I actually have come to the view after 43 years of being a practicing social scientist with the necessary disclosures, that there is really an innate human tendency, particularly when people get to be organizational leaders, to evade accountability and amass power. And let's keep in mind, information is power. So, you know, if you'd like to have more power, even in a kind of semi-innocent way as a democratic leader, you know, you want more room for maneuver. And the less you have to disclose, the more information you can hold close to your vest, the less oversight and scrutiny, you know, the more autonomy you have to lead, govern, control, whatever verb you want to use. And let's just be crystal clear about this. The acceptance by leaders of any organization or government, even in a liberal democracy, of transparency, accountability, scrutiny, oversight is, in my opinion, not a natural human instinct. And so to quote variations on a theme that has been stated in many ways, you know, power never voluntarily and happily yields. It has to be held accountable. It has to be, you know, compelled to accept transparency, scrutiny, oversight, and so on. And that is the role of parliaments. It is the role of civil societies. It is the role of the mass media. It is the role of bar associations, parliamentary committees, if necessary, if civil liberties and the rule of law are at risk here, of judiciaries that enforce the rights of citizens. It's the role of parliaments and congresses to think about what new legislation is needed. And I do believe new legislation is needed in the digital era we are in to protect the rights of citizens, to have their privacy and their data protected, made portable, come under their control, to be alerted to what's being held. Citizens need protection from all actors with power, not just government, but the corporations they work for, the organizations, and so on. Secondly, I think one thing you can glean from these two case studies, these excellent presentations, and a lot of the work, is that in democracies, let's start with democracies, but therefore in all societies, citizen awareness of the risks they face, and not just in the immediate term, but in the very long run, because, data could be stored permanently if the law is not bent to the interests of human rights. The risks they run to the surrender of their freedom, their privacy, their human rights, by data storage, data collection, data accumulation, data transfer in the digital age. And I think there is a need, an enormous opportunity to develop a, frankly, curriculum, a civic education curriculum that could be a component of secondary education, and then again, maybe starting before secondary school and continuing with a component in higher education, but also that civic organizations could promote to, adult citizens who finish their schooling to understand the risks and vulnerabilities they face in the new digital age of, as this excellent report that the Forum has produced makes clear, where data is just being produced from every conceivable angle by the, to my mind, mindless progression of the Internet of Things, and the unthinking surrender of privacy by people accepting all these digital monitors in their homes and their appliances without asking, where's the data going that's being collected here? Who's going to have it? Who's going to store it? How long is it going to last? Now I'd like to say something that is not exactly relevant to the problem of governments surveilling their citizens, but that broadens the aperture in the way I think we need to think about this in the digital age. Many universities and colleges, maybe most of them, are using private software vendors to help them collect, organize, and store digital information about their students, including, in at least a number of cases, anonymous reports about student behavior. I think in most cases, the students are unaware of the collection of this data. There's no transparency there either in the academy, which is supposed to be elevating human rights. And this probably, got plenty of people who are advocating for transparency in government collection of data. And who are these private vendors, and what's their level of accountability, and how long does this data last, and who can see it, and how is it stored? and what happens to the rights of these citizens, the students of colleges and universities, to know what's being collected on them and to challenge the potentially lasting, if not permanent, storage of information that has been anonymously reported and not even vetted. If this is happening at colleges and universities, what do you think's going on in cities and other government agencies, even in democracies? So we have an enormous amount of work to do to scrutinize and hold accountable all efforts to collect and store data, and to apply rigorous ethical standards that have been really, thought about and worked through by a variety of stakeholders. I think I will repeat, there are legitimate government interests in collecting photographic surveillance in cities. We would be less safe. We would be less able to control terrorism, crime, and so on without that. But without checks and balances, oversight and controls, and I think what we need is new community oversight boards in every city and maybe at national levels that would combine ethicists, maybe retired judges, possibly, civic leaders of various kinds, possibly elected representatives to work this through. A multi-stakeholder approach, I think, is absolutely essential to oversight and control. And my view is there is no adequate existing model for this. Now, the last set of things I would like to talk about concerns the specific problem of China providing the hardware and software for this. And anybody who has not heard the term dual circulation strategy as it applies to the philosophy, strategy, and intent of the Chinese Communist Party neo-totalitarian state to suck up as much data in the world as possible and permanently store it and use it, both to train their artificial intelligence to become the dominant leading source of artificial intelligence in the world, and to build files on as many people and societies in the world. And by the way, we haven't even talked about the genetic data that they're storing and profiling and what the heck they intend to do with that, in case anybody is thinking about doing OG. I wonder what my genealogy is. Well, you're going to take your swab and send your genetic data somewhere. I suggest you also find out where that genetic swab is going to be analyzed and possibly the data permanently stored. And in the case of China, there's a lot that we know in addition from Roukaya's work, from the work we've been doing at the Hoover Institution's project on China's global sharp power, from the work now over many years that Ned has been doing more broadly on sharp power and China's global sharp power, that this is a particularly dangerous game because of, first of all, you're not going to get any internal checks or concerns about civil liberties, human rights, privacy, or anything else from a neo-totalitarian state. Second of all, we know it is a matter of party doctrine, and the party rules the state, that there is no separation between any, quote, private sector Chinese corporation and the Chinese state. When the state, the party state, says, hand over your data, it will be handed over without hesitation, apology, or any reservation. And so to welcome Huawei into any provision of surveillance, photographic collection, facial recognition, or even 5G telephone network, is to welcome the Chinese Communist Party neo-totalitarian state into the collection of your country's and society's data. And if you're the African Union and you want a Belt and Road Initiative and you want the People's Republic of China to build your headquarters in Addis Ababa, well, fine, go ahead. But then accept the fact that the People's Republic of China is going to plant listening devices in the walls of all your offices and meeting rooms so that everything the African Union says and does and discusses can be efficiently transmitted back to Beijing. So I think we need to promote much more awareness and understanding of the risks here, and understanding that this is not, a kind of Western strategy to restrain Chinese competition. It's an international human rights strategy and coalition to defend privacy, transparency, accountability, and civil liberties.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, thank you for that powerful roundup of some of the different issues in play here. And I think a number of points that really resonated with me. First, that issue of information is power, and the way technologies that are becoming increasingly widespread and increasingly popular create the temptation to hoard information on the part of actors that already enjoy an outsized amount of power in society, and how grassroots actors and civic movements can think about how to counterbalance that. The question of what new types of multi-stakeholder processes and monitoring institutions can be created in order to realize these democratic guardrails in practice. And then finally, the question of what happens downstream with the data that's being collected by all of these tools that are exported, particularly by vendors from the PRC. So we have a number of great questions that have come in from our audience. I am going to, just for the sake of flow, pick one that is rather closely related actually to one of the points that you, Larry, raised, which is the question of what kind of local institutions and processes can be created to monitor how smart cities are being implemented and protect those human rights guardrails. And are there current examples of this or aspirational ideas of ways in which you would have these more multi-stakeholder oversight processes working with smart cities? Bárbara, if you don't mind me picking on you, I remember that in your report, you looked a little bit at ways in which municipalities could engage with new types of actors on smart cities in order to have a more kind of responsible human rights oriented design. So I wonder if you might want to pick that one up.
Yeah, great. So yeah, we have here in Brazil some examples of good practices of multi-stakeholder participation and engagement with tech developments. And I would like to give the example of the municipality of Vinhedo in the state of São Paulo, which created a data protection law at the municipal level. And this law was created through all this participatory process that involved different scholars and also specialists on the subject of data protection. And this was a really interesting process because it showed the need for public managers, public officers at the local level to understand the principles of data protection and to put in practice. So it raised the awareness that at this local level of, well, we should be compliant with the law, and how the law, the federal level law could be applied to the municipal level particularities. So there is this experience here that is an interesting one. And we also have audit offices at the local level that should be instructed to look at the tech risks involved in the development of smart city technologies, smart city projects. So I think they should be there should be incentives to the look of also the risks involved in the adoption of technology smart city project. And one thing that concerns me also is the need to oversight the public budget in relation to these projects, because besides the questions regarding the risk-benefit balance between, well, the adoption of a technology and its potential benefits, there's also the fact that some of these technologies are being developed with arguments that are not really related to their main purposes. So just to give an example, here at Internet Lab, we've done recently a research on the use of facial recognition by schools. And many of the managers that implement these technologies claim it's for educational purpose, but it's actually a surveillance technology. So there is a part of the public budget that is addressed to educational purposes, and that is being used for the development and acquisition of surveillance technology. So there's a lack of really adjustment on the purpose of the technology used there. And we should and must have public organs that oversight these sorts of uses and developments. That should be the audit offices we already have in place. But I think they should be more there should be more incentives for they to look at the risks posed by these technologies, so that one of our recommendations, for example, is the need for impact assessments on data protection and human rights, but they shouldn't be seen just as the step to a formal checklist. They should be really put into practice. That should be an oversight organ that put the monitoring of these practices into question. So I think these are the main things I would like to add on maybe the steps that could be taken to a more democratic approach for smart cities here.
Thanks, Barbara. And that question of impact assessments, I think, is very important, and also responds. I think that's another topic that drew some interest from our audience. Just what types of measures can you introduce during the procurement process in order to consider some of these risks? That would certainly be one of them. Roukaya, I know your kind of case perhaps has more more negative examples than positive ones, but nonetheless, any kind of proposals you'd like to make in terms of monitoring and oversight institutions?
I think, we have some excellent institutions. The Parliament was an important institution. The National Audit Bureau was an important institution that actually acts as checks and balances, especially the National Audit Bureau that looks at public institutions in terms of public expenses. But the problem is that, the whole data collection, the digitalization process is happening in a total vacuum. And unfortunately, this total vacuum, you have laws that are there. We talked about the Data Protection Act, which is an excellent piece of legislation, but there seems to be, purposely crafted within those legislation, provisos or possibilities to actually sort of, supersede some of those core legislations. So I think what we need to do is to probably learn from best practices that are happening in terms of management of public data. Very often we also said that, by working on the Mauritius Safe City, and that was maybe one of the motivations that brought me to start to research about that it could act as a lightning rod or an example for other countries to sort of see what are the trappings around that. So I think at the moment, the absence of an enabling environment which can actually act as checks and balances. But I believe, there are certain examples that we can sort of push and strengthen. I think the media is an important one. I've been, the media in terms of telling the story or highlighting some of the bad practices or the opaque practices. Recently, we see the media, for example, talking a little bit more about the Mauritius Safe City, talking a little bit more about Huawei as a vendor, talking a little bit more about the China-Mauritius axis. So I think pushing those types of conversation into the public domain can bring about what Larry mentioned, this public awareness that digitalization has a number of threats, because we have a tendency to say, well, we have arrived and we have become modern. So I think we need to consolidate that environment, make sure that the laws that are put in place are not twinkled around or moved around, because otherwise, the system will very quickly implode. So I'm sorry that there are more negative outcomes, but I think out of those negative things, we need to start building those guardrails. And I think civil society can be the first frontier in terms of ensuring that happens.
Absolutely. So again, the importance of that multi-stakeholder approach. Again, thanks for, I think, a summary of some very important points here. I'll turn just to perhaps round out the audience questions segment of this to another key theme that I see a couple of people have taken an interest here, which is smart cities and corruption. And so clearly, a lack of transparency is a challenge that both of you have mentioned, and these are often big budget projects that would seem to present significant corruption risks. So what kind of corruption risks have you seen in smart cities, and what can be done to address that challenge? Whoever wants to start.
I'll start. I think what we've been, I mentioned that there has been the possibility of kickbacks in the case of the Mauritius Safe City project, because, following the resignation of the previous CEO, the board of the Mauritius Telecom, and remember, there was, a number of contracts. There was a contract that was signed between Mauritius Telecom and Huawei. One was a service provider and one was the provider of security equipment. And then there was another one that was signed between Mauritius Telecom and the Mauritius police. Now, things are starting to come to the surface, and all the indications that we see is that there might be kickbacks or corruption. We don't know the depth of that, but I think the Mauritius Safe City is part of what we call the big ticket infrastructure, where big loans are given. Very often we don't know the details of those loans. We don't know what impact it will have on the public purse. We do not have any understanding in terms of what's going to entail out of that. So I think corruption is definitely a dimension of that, and that's why we need to be able to follow big ticket infrastructure. And I think there are certain countries, I know in Africa, that do follow the money and do actually demand where the money is going and how it's being used. So I think there is obviously links around corruption, but we are not sure because it's so opaque, and and very often there are many players who are involved in that whole process. So I think once the cover starts to be lifted, we will start to see some of those practices. And I always refer to the case of Serbia, which had a smart city project championed by the previous government. And when the new government came in, there was a complete a spring cleaning around that project, and then we started to realize the malpractices, the corruption linked processes, and I think whether we have to wait for a change of government to actually see the depth of the problems linked to corruption, linked to data manipulation, linked to data capture, might be the case. So corruption is definitely a dimension of that, but how far and how strong and how deep, that needs further investigation.
So again, pointing to some additional areas of oversight and investigation that need to be developed with an important role for civil society. Bárbara, anything you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I'd just like to add the risk that personal data be seen as a bargaining chip between the government and private companies for different purposes than the ones directly related to the public purposes. So the secondary uses that might have that we lack opacity, that we lack transparency, and we are uncertain of what these purposes might be. So there is this risks. There are these risks, and also something that is of our concern is the fact that many of these acquisition processes depart from the most formal rights provided by our administrative law here. For example, these are not acquisitions made by a bidding process, but actually for a donation that a private company made for a municipality. So, well, what are the grounds of these donations? What are the limits? What are the ethical boundaries that should be looked at before the implementation of a technology like that? Because these types of acquisition, they can create the risks of corruption and the use of these technologies and development of the smart cities project. So I think I would add these two different lines there.
Yeah, thanks. I think that is a really important point as well, that when we're thinking about corruption here, it may not just mean kickbacks. There's also kind of a broader set of questions around imbalances in the relationship between public authorities and vendors, and whether that can lead to abuses of power or to certain unhealthy dependencies. Really important point. Larry, anything you'd like to add on smart cities and corruption before we close out the segment?
Well, 2 points. One is that whenever you're dealing with China, Belt and Road Initiative, other contracting, Huawei vendors, that, Roukaya has made this point, and it just jumps out of all our work, your work at the Forum and our work at Hoover. The lack of transparency is a kind of militant PRC condition. And whenever you have lack of transparency, again, human nature creeps in. There's going to be abuse, but China plays on this. I think it sees that it has a comparative advantage in winning relationships and taking command of data by manipulating relations of Roukaya had a polite word for it, kickbacks. That's not that polite, but it's just deep corruption. And, let's not lose sight of the way that the work the Forum has done on kleptocracy can circle back and intersect with this as people really start accumulating large amounts of money from these kickbacks. And the second thing is that we do have this just authoritarian creep in a lot of places, creeping authoritarianism and assaults on civil society, declines in the quality of democracy and civil liberties, pressure on independent media. We haven't even talked about India in that regard, but it's probably not far along on this path yet, but it will be. And you can't separate the concerns we're talking about here from the broader concerns about defending and renewing democracy.
That's a very important closing statement there, for sure, that many of these different transnational challenges, while we may handle them in kind of distinct buckets, in fact, intersect in important ways, as we've certainly heard with these cases of both potential corruption and authoritarian influence linked to smart city projects. So I had initially planned to have a lightning round of 3 questions that I'd pose to all of you in 30 seconds each. I think in the interest of keeping us time, you'll get off the hook and I am only going to ask you one. But I think it's one that's important to leave us with, and that is, if you just had to name, and of course there are many, but for the sake of this conversation, one key venue or one key area where you think it's important for civil society to engage in the shaping of norms for next generation technologies, what would that be? Just 30 seconds, and starting with Larry, because you're at the top of my screen.
Okay, I would say the 2 things are rights to privacy and the right to be forgotten, which addresses the issue of the length of time for which data can be stored without people's explicit consent.
All right, thank you. That was indeed under 30 seconds. Turning to Roukaya.
Well, I think it's the right for people to know and understand what is being fed to them, because I think this whole digitalization race, and people are sort of always wanting to be connected, always wanting to be in the know, artificial intelligence doing their work. And I think being aware and conscious that there are a number of trappings linked to that. So I think people should be more conscious, more willing to understand, and also be more willing to stand up and understand that, you know, if they don't stand up, their rights will disappear under their nose.
Right. On the borderline, but important closing words, and Bárbara, please.
Well, for me, it's impossible to cite just one key venue, but I think there are important technology developments on the areas of health, on the health sector, and on finance sector too, that civil society should engage in the following years. And also it should engage on criminal procedure laws and rules regarding the relationship between tech and the criminal procedure law. So I think that these are the main issues I would pose for civil society to engage with.
All right, fantastic. I know that is always difficult to do, but I think a range of important issues to leave in the minds of our audience as we close out. So thanks to all of you, both for those responses and for overall an extremely rich discussion. And to close us out, I'd like to turn things over to Chris Walker, NED's Vice President for Studies and Analysis.
Well, thank you so much, Beth. This has been such a terrific discussion, and there's so many points I could touch on. That were offered with such clarity by the speakers, who just did a wonderful job of putting into perspective the challenge we're facing. And I think I would emphasize just several things that really caught my ear. One is the speed with which these technologies are moving, both within the context of smart cities and beyond it, certainly with regarding emerging technologies, their intrusiveness, and also that this is happening at scale. And in a basic way, what came through in so many parts of the discussion was the extent to which societies, decision makers, don't really understand what they're dealing with. And Larry's point, Roukaya's point, Barbara's point, Beth, your points, all made during the discussion, was that we need to find a way to really surge transparency and accountability around these technologies, to enhance the understanding that society at large has about them, but also people who are making the decisions. I think it's also the case that the very attractive ways in which these technologies can be framed in the smart and safe cities context, it's about security and safety and efficiencies. Those have to be interrogated really, really carefully, to make sure that the underlying purposes of the technologies in practice actually align with the stated marketing terms that hover around these technologies all too often. And I think there's a lot of work that can be done on that front in the civil society sector to accelerate the understanding and sharpen the way in which we're thinking about these things. As I say, there's a lot more I could emphasize on that, but maybe I'll leave my comments on the substance of events there. In addition to this, I'd really like to thank our colleagues, Ariane Gottlieb, Lily Sable, and Josie Brodfear, for their support of this event. I want to thank the speakers, Bárbara, Roukaya, and Larry, and also Beth for her masterful moderation, and everyone who took the time to participate in this online event. I'd remind everyone that the basis for this was a truly first-rate report in which Roukaya and Bárbara contributed, as did Beth, and I would commend everyone who hasn't had a chance to read this to go to our website and take a look at the Smart Cities and Democratic Vulnerabilities report. So thank you again to everyone for joining us, and please follow our work on this in the future.